So, good evening. I'm so sorry that we are not meeting atom to atom, and I'm also very grateful that we are able to meet electron to electron, partly thanks to technology and our wonderful team who are organizing this, and also thanks to Antony. The reason why we're not meeting atom to atom in the National Liberal Club as planned is because Antony Beevor has COVID. He's tested positive for COVID. He assures me he's feeling okay. He's kindly agreed to do this via Zoom. And so we're going to proceed as if we were in the National Liberal Club. I'm going to introduce Antony and say a little bit about the campaign, and Antony's going to talk for a bit. And then we're going to have questions, and we have a link with which you can ask questions, which is is.gd/askbeevor, and that will come up on the on my screen, and you can either send a question that way or stick your hand up, and if I can, I shall take you live in the Zoom call. So that's the menu for this evening, and I just want to say a few things though about the campaign. We had a great fillip to our chances with the Lib Dem local election results in May, and our few months, sadly too few months of campaigning in Marylebone got us into a good second place there and turned a rock solid Tory ward into a marginal for next time. I'm heading off to Tiverton soon for what we confidently hope will be another stellar by-election success. And we've also been out and about in the Barbican and Pimlico. But we want to win the parliamentary seat of the cities of London and Westminster. Boris Johnson's doing his bit to help us, but you can do your bit too, and we'll have more about that later. So tonight's event is partly to give our hardworking campaigners some interesting food for thought. It's partly to raise money. It's partly to help Antony sell his books. Sadly, we don't have piles and piles of them at the side of the room as we would have done if this had been a physical event, but you can still order them from any good bookseller, preferably go into the bookseller and buy it there, but if all else fails, you can buy it on Amazon. This is the book, Russia's Revolution and Civil War, and I've so enjoyed reading it. And it couldn't really be more topical. A great deal of the action, very bloodthirsty action, happens in places that we're reading about right now, whether it's from the Crimea, other places in what's now Ukraine. And it wasn't that long ago. People often think the Russian Civil War was ancient history, but it's less than 100 years ago that the Russian Civil War was still going on. Vladivostok didn't fall to the Red Army until October 2022. So I've got loads of questions for Antony. To me, the most striking one is how on earth did the Whites manage to lose, given they were up against these appalling opponents, the Bolsheviks, who were so unpopular, so badly organized, feuding with each other, and they had so much support from so many other countries, and yet they still were able to wrest defeat from the jaws of victory. But there's a great deal more to talk about than that, and I look forward to having your questions as well. But Antony, I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
if you can. You can. Wonderful.
Yes.
Good.
Oh, absolutely.
So give us. This is I say this is just the latest in a great series of fantastic books you've written. I was gripped by Stalingrad, the Battle for Berlin, got you very unpopular because the Russians thought you were being unfair on the Red Army, and there are many other books as well. But give us an introduction to this book and to your many fans who are hanging on your every word.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, it would be a grave misunderstanding to regard the Russian Civil War, which lasted from 1917 to 1921, as a local affair. Not only did this conflict extend across the whole of the Eurasian landmass, from Central Europe to the Far East, more than a sixth of the Earth's surface, as Soviet propaganda later emphasized. it also involved countless nations in a form of proxy world war. Far from being a merely an internal conflict between reds and whites, it had immense geopolitical ramifications with many countries and foreign troops, British, French, American, Czechoslovak, Japanese, Italian, Serbian, Greek, and Romanian. And it affected all the former parts of the Russian Empire, including Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Georgia. And the Bolsheviks' Red Army included many units of internationalist volunteers, former prisoners of war from the German, Austrian, Hungarian, and Bulgarian armies, as well as regiments raised from Chinese laborers. The death toll of around 10 million civilians and soldiers, perhaps even as many as 12 million, had major international consequences. Accounts of the horrors and destruction triggered either a frantic terror of Bolshevism or of white vengeance right across the world. The impersonal cruelty of political ideology and the frenzied violence of the enraged mob created a vicious circle of fear and loathing, which led eventually to the Spanish Civil War and then the Second World War. So although most historians recognize the First World War as what they describe as the original catastrophe of the 20th century, it was its aftermath, the Russian Civil War, which became the most influential conflict of the age. And it still has its echoes today, as we're seeing in Ukraine. Fratricidal wars are bound to be cruel because of their lack of definable front lines, because they're instant extension into civilian life, and because of the terrible hatreds and suspicions which they engender. Yet the brutality of the Russian onslaught, which we've seen in Ukraine, has raised a debate about its origins. For example, David Aronovich in the Times recently speculated about what he called the casual savagery of Russian troops in Ukraine. One can never, of course, generalize about a whole nation, especially not Russia, with all of its different component nationalities and its historic split between Slavophiles and Westerners going back to Peter the Great. And above all, there can be no such thing as a DNA-based national character. Yet at the same time, most countries are often influenced, at least subconsciously, by certain self-images or national narratives. Perhaps ever since the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, the Russian attitude has been conditioned to the idea that conspicuous violence and cruelty is a natural weapon of war. Fire and sword, terror, rape, and looting. This was true in 1945 as revenge for the barbarous Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, just as it was in the Russian Civil War. Even just after the First World War's unprecedented slaughter, outside observers could hardly believe that brutality. On the 4th of April, 1919, the captain of the Royal Navy destroyer HMS Montrose wrote home from the Crimean coast. I called on Colonel Count Rimsky-Korsakov, who commanded the remnants of the Tsarist Life Guards. He asked me to send his compliments to the colonel of our first Life Guards. Poor chaps, no wonder they looked a party of ruffians as they sat in the low cottage living room. The small, dirty window, dimly illuminated the filthy table they fed around. War has made fiends of the illiterate, simple-minded, superstitious Russian peasants and devils of the reckless, drunken, pleasure-loving aristocracy they wish to exterminate. Both sides are equally barbarous, and the torture applied to prisoners is so inhuman that I cannot write it here. Every man carries a grenade fastened to his tunic button with which to blow off his own head if captured. In the centuries before the revolution of February 1917, which brought down the Romanov dynasty, the Russian Empire had suffered occasional explosions of terrifying violence. The insurrection of 1773, led by the Cossack peasant Yemelyan Pugachev, prompted Alexander Pushkin to write of Russian revolt senseless and merciless. The great writer Maxim Gorky, who knew the reality of the oppressed poor better than any Bolshevik, had no doubts. During that revolution of February 1917, he visited the burnt-out ruins of the Okhrana headquarters in Petrograd. And he predicted to the Menshevik, Nikolai Sukhanov, who accompanied him, that the revolution was bound to lead to Asiatic savagery. Gorky was not alone in his prediction of the horrors to come. As the winter of 1917 approached, it brought a marked change in mood from heady optimism to fear. The young journalist Konstantin Paustovsky wrote that the misty romanticism of the February Revolution was rapidly evaporating, along with the belief in universal happiness. He described how the veteran writer Vladimir Gilyarovsky, with his sheepskin cap, extravagant moustache, and hoarse voice, entered the newsroom. "You suckling babes," he growled at all the idealistic youngsters present, "socialists, mouldering liberals. I know the Russian people, and they'll show you yet where lobsters spend the winters." Ideological civil wars in the 20th century almost always arouse more savagery than state-on-state wars, because the suspicions and fear of being surrounded by treachery are so much greater. Those trapped in enemy territory had to pretend to have political opinions they abhorred just to survive. And in societies such as Spain and Russia, where men felt obliged to demonstrate conspicuous courage, the suppression of fear produced a truly explosive charge of violence when unleashed. Yet although it is one thing to want to exterminate your enemies out of a combination of fear and hatred, that does not explain the degree of pointless cruelty which so often emerged in the Russian Civil War. Clearly, one factor in the violence came from the dehumanizing effects and trauma of the Eastern Front in the First World War. Trench life for Russian soldiers along the Eastern Front in 1917, running through the Baltic provinces, Belarusia, Galicia, and Romania, was an inhuman experience. Having dug themselves into the ground, wrote Gorky, they live in rain and snow, in filth, in cramped conditions. They're being worn out by disease and eaten by vermin. They live like beasts. Desperately short of ammunition, many lacked boots, and they even had to resort to bast shoes made from birch bark. Casualty clearing stations at the front were almost as primitive as in the Crimean War. Army censorship departments could have had little illusion about the state of morale at the front on reading soldiers' letters home. Many complained of being hopelessly outgunned by the German artillery and of the utterly callous attitude of officers towards them. Men were either brutalized or traumatized by what they saw. Corpses are still lying there, wrote one in a letter. Ravens have already eaten their eyes and rats are crawling on the bodies. Oh my God, this terrible sight can neither be described or imagined. Intense resentment was caused by the contrasting conditions between officers and men. Most officers retired each night to the warmth and relative comfort of peasant isbas behind the front, while their soldiers and sergeants were left in the cold and squalor of the trenches. During that pre-revolutionary winter of 1916 to 1917, criticism of the government in Petrograd did not just come from the liberals and the left. Even the arch-conservative politician Vasily Shulgin was appalled by the irresponsibility of the rich, indifferent to the fact that Russian casualties were running at twice the rate of their German and Austro-Hungarian enemies. And here we are, he wrote bitterly, dancing the last tango on the breastworks of trenches choked with corpses. As the tumultuous year of 1917 advanced, more and more soldiers deserted from the front, and the refusal of local garrisons to obey orders rapidly upended the traditional order in the countryside. Although some enlightened landowners were tolerated or even protected by their peasants and house servants, the vast majority had to flee during the course of the year. There were comparatively few examples of landowners killed in the early spring of 1917, even though many manor houses were set ablaze. Yet in the charged atmosphere, minor incident, especially when peasants or soldiers managed to seize a store of alcohol, could lead to mindless violence. Around Mtsensk in May, some 5,000 peasants and soldiers, having looted a wine cellar, went berserk over 3 days and set fire to estates in the area. They had an uncontrollable urge to smash, to set fire to, or literally to defile the precious objects of the nobility and gentry. Yet their bitterness only increased when they found that destroying or defiling the past did not make the present any better. Even handing over everything to the peasants seemed to do little good. In her father's absence, the young Princess Baturin addressed the local peasants who'd come en masse from the village of Inozemka. She told them that the family had already declared that the whole estate and the manor house were theirs. I implore you, don't destroy, she said, don't demolish what is already there, yours. The peasants stood there silently, she wrote. They'd come with poles and axes, with sacks. Some brought carts. Someone in the crowd shouted out, one landlord is gone, there will come another. Take what you can while you can. And the rampage began. They broke off the huge doors of the house, although no one could use them. They were far too big for any izba. They put into the sacks everything they could lay their hands on, tore pages from leather-covered books to use for rolling cigarettes. They tore off the padlocks from the barns and loaded and took away the grain. In less than 3 hours, the estate was empty. A horrified young Grand Duke and cousin of the Tsar admitted in his diary, the people's hatred has been brewing for far too long. Yet it was not long before even poor peasants became victims too. A former artillery officer, Alexander Makonin, received a letter from his soldier orderly who had returned home to his small holding. The orderly recounted in this letter how a group of Bolsheviks had turned up at their izba and demanded that he surrender his only cow. I told them, he wrote to Makonin, that the cow was all I had left and that my youngest child needed milk, so that I could not give her to them. Very well, they answered, we will see to it that your brat does not need milk anymore. And in spite of my struggles, they tore my youngest child out of my arms and bashed her head in against a wall, and then they took my cow and left me with my dead baby. Sorry. Although a friend of Lenin, Maxim Gorky attacked the way that the Bolshevik leader welcomed this mass violence and destruction, bulldozing aside the old order because he thought it made the revolution irreversible. Lenin had calculated that once peasants had chased off or massacred landowning families, and industrial workers had done the same to foremen, managers, and factory owners, then the workers and peasants would feel forced to defend their gains. Yet Lenin, despite the Bolshevik promise of land and liberty to the peasants, had every intention of nationalizing the land and collectivizing farms. And in the cities, absolute party control would be established through the Soviets. With the same deliberate falsehoods, he promised peace to the soldiers, while determined to turn the imperialist war against Germany into a universal civil war. The writer, Viktor Shklovsky, compared Lenin's reckless experiment in social upheaval to the story from an old Russian folktale, in which a devil's apprentice boasts that he can rejuvenate an old man. To restore his youth, all he needed to do was first to burn him up. So he set him on fire, but then found that he could not revive him. It was indeed a striking parable to illustrate Lenin's total disregard for humanity in his attempts to transform a vast country through social engineering and create the new human species of Homo Sovieticus. To turn a country as large as Russia completely upside down could only be achieved by massive force and suffering in a pitiless conflict. Yet for far too long, we have made the mistake of talking about wars as a single entity, when they're often a conglomeration of different clashes, mixing national resentments, ethnic hatreds, and class warfare. And when it comes to civil war, there is also on both sides a clash of centralism against regionalism and authoritarianism against libertarianism. For the sake of simplicity, we've grown used to the idea and the name of the Russian Civil War, but that in itself is misleading, as I said at the beginning. One historian recently described the conflict instead as a world war condensed. And to re-emphasize the importance of its consequences, it is indeed what it later led to in 1939. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Anthony. And I was worried about those coughs. I wonder if you're quite as well. You've been incredibly brave and said it.
I think I'll survive, Edward. Thank you very much.
I hope there's something nice in that mug. Perhaps
no, unfortunately, I can't hit the alcohol, I'm afraid, at all because of the chemo. But anyway, there we go.
Well, we'll make up. We'll make up for it at some future date.
Yes,
but,
yes.
No, I think this idea of the Civil War as being far more than just the sort of the Reds and the Whites, but all the ethnic and class conflict and the huge dose of geopolitics thrown in is what makes it so interesting. I was wondering if you could just pull out a little bit more the sort of the difference between Lenin's, as you put, reckless, malign, brilliant, sort of demonic intelligence on one side, and the whites on the other, who seemed to be stultifyingly stupid. And it was a sort of almost a war between the brilliant but horrible and the people who were sort of horrible but very, very stupid on the other side. Did you find anyone on the white side who showed any idea of what they were dealing with, or had any I think there was one chap who fell through the ice in the retreat from Siberia, but it was a startlingly dim-witted bunch of an appalling bunch of people on the white leaders' side.
Well, the whites really were a totally incompatible alliance. I mean, you had this mixture of what were called right socialist revolutionaries, which does sound a slight contradiction in terms, inevitably, but basically they were sort of moderate socialists who were appalled by the coup d'etat of the Bolsheviks in October 1917. And their great following was really in the sort of the Volga region. And they were determined to continue the work to set up the Constituent Assembly, which Lenin had ordered to be disbanded in January of that year. And amongst them, there were some very impressive people. But of course, they stood no chance against the arch-reactionaries and the czarists on the military side, who they allied with. One of their own officers, in fact, who was a right socialist revolutionary, a sort of moderate socialist, was Vladimir Putin, who was a hugely impressive man. But as you rightly say, he stood out by, shall we say, his exceptional position, unlike many of the others. They did have one or two good generals in terms of purely military terms, like General Mayaevsky, who was this vastly obscene and overweight character, but who was actually a very clever commander. But most of them were absolute brutes and believed in not just in returning the peasantry to almost to serfdom, but even to take revenge on them for having taken over some of the estates and so forth. But their fundamental obtuseness really was linked to their idea of the Russian Empire, that the Russian Empire should never be allowed to disintegrate. And here, of course, they have quite a lot in common with Vladimir Putin. And even though they could have actually won the Civil War if they had allied themselves with Finland, Estonia, and Poland. But they were all boasting that, you know, as soon as we do win, we're going to bring you back into the Russian Empire. And they're terribly arrogant and contemptuous of the nationalism of the independence of all of those nationalities. Churchill simply couldn't understand how they could be quite so blunt and stupid in this particular way, but there wasn't very much he could do about it. And that is really why they stood little chance of winning, along with a number of other points, like, for example, the Reds had internal lines. They were able to reinforce their different fronts much more rapidly, while the Whites were never in any form of communication. But I think it's basically that real obstinate view of the past which trapped them. And I think we see this problem of an obstinate view of the past still today in the Kremlin.
Well, it is. I'm very glad you brought us to the present day, because I think it's it's so interesting that imperialism is both the fuel and the poison at the same time. What gets Russian leaders out of bed in the morning is this sort of imperialist thinking, and it's also the reason why they go to bed in the evening having made things worse rather than better. And
Indeed.
So I should say that among our mouldering liberals, and we wear that badge with pride, we have some quite serious Russia experts who are on the campaign. And I see Christopher Peters, who I've known for many years, who used to live in Moscow, has got a very good question here where he says, is it fair to say that conflict, internal and external, is Russia's natural state? And if that is the conclusion, how should this influence our policy? For the next 1991 style collapse, should we let Russia dissolve? And I wonder if in your study of history, you had any thoughts about how strong the glue is really that holds Russia together.
Well, I think the Russian attitude to conflict is a curious one in the sense that it romanticizes both the two nations, both of self-sacrifice. And that was obviously exploited very much under the Soviet regime. And also, it also unites this idea of the romanticization of violence. And I think we've seen this on numerous occasions. But I'll go back a little bit to what I was saying, and I think it is important, this attitude towards the past, not just that war can only be fought really with sort of conspicuous violence as using it as a weapon, but also that the war is not necessarily the natural state of affairs, but it is something which Russia must always expect because the world is against it. You know, it is definitely Russia contra mundum, and this goes back a very, very long way, long before the Soviet Union even. That, of course, with the Allied intervention during the course of the Civil War, again underlined this attitude of Russia that the world was going to be against them, and certainly Putin has managed to achieve that in a very, very short space of time. So talk about a self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't think there's a sort of clearer example. Yeah. But I'd like to hear his view.
And there's a paradox here, because it's anyone who's lived in the Soviet Union or studied Soviet version of history will be aware that they have this. It's one of their sort of foundational myths: is the capitalist powers try to strangle the revolution at birth, and so the failure of the intervention, whether it was in Murmansk or in the Baltics, or in the Far East, or through the Crimea, or even the wonderful Caspian flotilla, the Royal Navy flying the White Fleet on the Caspian Sea. Not many people know about that, but it leaves a sort of it feeds Russian paranoia. This eye of Russia contra mundum is not totally unfounded. But I see we've got a question from Natalie Ubalava, who hails from Georgia, as you may guess from her surname. And she says, a related question to Peter's, is it a particular evil genius of Russian imperialism that colonial oppression of the conquered nations was never recognized on a par with similar oppressions by other European nations? Russia's always been the poorer empire, brutal and backward nonetheless, and its conquests were neighbors, as opposed to other empires which tend to conquer faraway places. And these nations were more easily assimilated into Russia than the overseas empires of European nations. And her question really is how does Ukraine change that narrative? And I know in your book you write very revealingly about this sort of nascent Ukrainian state, which is bursting to get free with German backing. And then I think it's 9 months or something they manage, and then it all falls apart. So any thoughts on that, Antony?
Well, it's a question of sea. I mean, you know, if Russia had been surrounded by sea, perhaps it wouldn't have felt so vulnerable in the first place. It's not an island nation like us at all. And I know although that is very, very obvious, I think that we've also.
Oops. Help. something's gone wrong here. I hope someone from the technical team can restore Antony. I don't know what's happened, but I think people can still hear me. So I will just, while we're trying to regain Antony in voice and picture, I will, there was another very interesting aspect to this sort of arrogance of the whites, which is a country which took shape briefly in 1918, which was a Turkic moderate Islamic, or as they put it, Euro-Islam republic of called Idel Oral. And this was a sort of proto-state of what's now Tatarstan and Bashkiria. And they were very keen on being that Islam was a modernizing religion. They saw Islam as being against the kind of backwardness of the Tsarist empire. And are you back, Antony?
I am back. I'm sorry about that. Something flashed up covering the whole screen, and I tried to get rid of it and managed to get rid of everything. I'm so sorry.
So I'm giving a little disquisition about the Turkic Bashkir proto-state just to fill that while, but we'll go back to you. Please carry on where you were.
Well, no, it was just simply to say that there always seems to be a difference between colonialism with adjoining with an adjoining landmass and overseas colonialism and the way that it is judged. And I did remember with a, shall we say, a discussion with a certain very pro-Kremlin professor who was trying to argue that actually the Russian imperialism in the Caucasus and southern Russia and Central Asia was no different to the United States occupation of the southwestern states and the Hispanic and Native American areas. Which I found an interesting parallel in a way, but one which I didn't find very entirely convincing. But I mean, there is an element of truth there which exists, and I think that is really the difference. And I think this has been a problem also in the way that we never expected, or only a tiny minority, a very distinguished small minority, actually foresaw Putin's invasion of Ukraine. In a way, there is one parallel with the 1930s. I mean, the British and the French had been so horrified by the First World War that they could not believe that anybody would want to have another European war, and that's why they did not take Hitler's threat seriously. And this happened again. I think that we made the mistake of thinking that, well, Putin's war in Chechnya and in Syria and all the rest of it doesn't count in quite the same way. Well, it should have done. And I think this was a mistake we all made. And as I say, there were very, very few people who actually realized that he would go through with it.
Yes, well, we're all much wiser after the event, I fear. There's an interesting question from Guy de Celia on this, saying that given what a terrible failure Russia has been, post-Soviet Russia has been far weaker than the Soviet Union, and that we're overstating things if we draw an analogy, certainly if we draw an analogy with Hitler. So we might want to reflect on that. And there's also a very good question from Ludovico Zanetti, who is another one of our activists. And thank you so much, Ludovico, to you and Natalia for all your work and support. And he has a brilliant question that the Russia we face today seems to merge the most reactionary and arrogant element of the whites with Bolshevik brutality. So we've got kind of red and white combined in Putin. And
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think that, I mean, one sees this in, you know, in that ridiculous white hall in the Kremlin with that preposterous long table. Because actually there are only 4 statues in that room and they're all of Tsars. You've only got to see Navalny's video of the Putin's palace on the Black Sea, and it's double-headed eagles everywhere. So Putin is very much, he's also, by the way, he's also a crashing snob. He really loves sort of mixing with what he thinks of the old aristocracy as well. But the point is really that he has deliberately mixed, I think, both red and white. And that was quite clever. I mean, for example, Vladimir Putin, who we were talking about a little bit earlier, his body was brought back for proper reburial, so was Denikin's. And that caused, in that sort of post-Soviet period, a big shock amongst those who'd supported him, because they felt this was totally incompatible with his notion of the collapse of the Soviet Union being the greatest geopolitical tragedy, et cetera, of the 20th century. And there is an element of that. I mean, he's a pick and mix man, as we know from his choice of history. He's certainly done that both deliberately, but also, I think, psychologically. I mean, at one point, he was even apparently considering, after a certain period as president, that he should be appointed supreme ruler, just like Admiral Kolchak, which would have been an intriguing one. How that would have gone down in certain quarters of the former Soviet Union would have been interesting to see.
But it is very interesting the way these completely incompatible elements are combined. And I always feel, if you go to Red Square and you see that Lenin's corpse is there unburied in its ghastly, creepy mausoleum,
yeah.
And then you just turn right and you wander down a bit and you get to the rebuilt Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, which is sort of a manifestation of sort of neo-Tsarist pomp. And if Lenin had seen the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, he would have probably said, didn't I mean to blow that one up? And if the people who'd been the original Christ the Saviour could see Lenin, they would say excommunicate him or send him off to the Kator for punishment. So it is extraordinarily contradictory, this. Though I suppose perhaps Britain possibly has elements of contradictoriness in its own history. We should perhaps not be too snooty about this.
Well, I think that's certainly true. Yes, David Starkey used to refer to the Church of England as sort of as a form of sort of British Shinto or whatever. But anyway, we do have some fairly strange combinations ourselves. It's certainly true.
But there's a very good question from Christopher, getting back to the violence and the brutality. And I have to say, I want everybody on this call to buy at least one copy of the book for themselves and a second copy of the book for their friends to take for the summer, and possibly a third one for Christmas. But I'd also advise them not to read it before bedtime, because it really is not terribly good for a peaceful night's sleep, reading this extraordinary catalogue of brutality. And Christopher's question is that, do you think that World War I was a sort of Pandora's box which released a torrent of cruelty and ruthlessness which had been barely seen in many countries for a good century, and shaped the 20th century's horrors for decades to follow? And do you think that and how far can the barbarism of the Civil War be explained in those terms, or how far is it just an intrinsic part of the sort of brutality inherent in the way Russia was run?
Well, there wasn't that degree of brutality on the German or Austro-Hungarian side. That is certainly true. And it wasn't as if actually Russian troops during the First World War committed atrocities. It did come later. I think that it, shall we say, prepared the ground, of what they rightly described as, the original catastrophe of the 20th century. It prepared the ground for the horrors which came later. But I think that was partly because moving from state-on-state warfare, where there were front lines, there were recognizable uniforms, and there were still attitudes of military discipline and behavior, which were accepted by both sides. All of that disappeared suddenly with the Civil War. And, you have leading Bolsheviks saying, it is the law of civil war to kill the wounded. As far as they were concerned, it was a totally different conflict. And from that point of view, I think that we see that after, if you like, the preparation in terms of everybody's sort of war weariness and sickness with war, suddenly to be forced into a new conflict where the enemy was not so identifiable and the suspicions ran deep, then you are going to get that knee-jerk reaction of fear. And fear actually, of course, is the main element within violence. It's really what triggers the worst aspects of it in warfare. So that's why I think that it changed, and rather it was not so much actually as the First World War, as I said, its conventional side, but it had prepared the ground, and then we see the real horrors developing afterwards.
Yes, I think that there's the idea of preparing the ground and then someone else sowing stuff on it is exactly the right sort of metaphor. But I think we've talked a lot about what was happening inside Russia, and David Lloyd, hello David, another great friend of ours, has said, could you just talk a bit more about the Allied intervention, because it was very extraordinary, wide range. We had I mentioned some of the British forces, but I think we had Italians both in the Far East and poor things up in Murmansk. We had Czechoslovak legions stranded on the Trans-Siberian Railway wanting to go home. There were Polish forces. And then there was obviously the Brits, there were German Landeswehr. And so take a few minutes just to talk us through the, if you like, the non-Russian, the external class of characters entering from stage left, stage right, up from the pit, down from the proscenium arch and all over the place, because it's an extraordinary story.
Well, to do it in a few minutes, I think would be optimistic to say the least. But anyway, I think the basic point is one has to remember where one is in a wider sense, because, of course, here we are at the end of 1918, beginning of 1919. The armistice is on the 11th of November, 1918. The Supreme Allied Command in Paris is basically taking on the redrawing of maps all over Europe, negotiating or listening to presentations from every single national and ethnic minority. And then in January, Woodrow Wilson is alarmed at the way that the Russian Civil War is developing. Suddenly, it's starting to become really quite bloody as the Germans pull out. Of course, the Reds and Whites tried to occupy the area, and of course the Poles too, because no eastern boundary of Poland had that bit been fixed at that particular time. He, just before leaving, he said, right, well, let's organize a conference on the Principal Islands, on Prince Islands in the Sea of Marmara. But both Reds and Whites refused to have anything to do with it. And this actually gave, it seemed, an opportunity to the two most fervent anti-Bolsheviks of Clemenceau and Winston Churchill, who had just been appointed Secretary of State for War. And Lloyd George, although he was wrong in many ways, I think his basic instinct was absolutely right, that to get involved in a civil war and certainly to send troops in and put boots on the ground would be disastrous. One has to remember there were already mutinies going on in the British Army, both in France and even back in Britain, on the very slow repatriation and demobilization of these huge forces, which have been summoned, have been conscripted during the course of the First World War. And I mean, they were all over the place. I mean, one's got to remember, you know, there was in Persia, there was the whole of the Mesopotamian front, and even in the Caucasus, and then, of course, in Allenby's forces in Palestine and all the rest of it. So from that point of view, he was right to be cautious, and Clemenceau was totally wrong, because he was determined to send in French troops and, of course, the French Navy into the Black Sea. And they suffered from terrible mutinies. And for the French, it was a very, very inglorious period. But at the same time, there were all these other countries, some of whom had been allies in the First World War, like Italy and Serbia and so forth, who were all determined to, if you like, establish their claim to increasing their territorial claims. And so therefore they wanted to send their own particular contingents, their own expeditionary forces. But in the Far East, you have therefore the competition between actually the Japanese and the Americans. The Japanese, who were an ally in the First World War, actually didn't really do any fighting apart from just taking over German colonies on the Chinese coast. But they were actually interested in taking over as much of Siberia as they possibly could. And they put no less than up to 88,000 troops into Siberia. And of course, the Americans, quite rightly, were extremely nervous about what their ambitions were in that area. So yes, I think that should give a very brief, rough idea of quite how complex the situation was during this particular period. And of course, why intervening in any foreign civil war is an absolute minefield, to put it mildly.
And of course, what's so interesting is that none of this was dressed up or motivated by any sort of humanitarian thing. If this sort of thing was happening now, you'd be having people saying, let's have a humanitarian corridors for refugees, let's try and get grain out, let's protect the, or even maybe let's protect the rules-based international order. But it was, with the possible exception of Woodrow Wilson, I don't think anybody was motivated by anything but the most impure of motives, really.
Well, I think that's true. One would also remember that, you know, people didn't have mobile telephones with cameras on, and there weren't basically any form of really of movie images, which is what has rather affected, I think, the move towards, or being an important element, if you like, in the move towards concern about civilian suffering and casualties. Out of sight, out of mind. I mean, you know, as far as the probably hundreds of thousands who died of the refugees, of typhus, of freezing to death in Siberia, on the Trans-Siberian Railway or anything like that, you know, people were unaware, and there were one or two very distinguished journalists, it's true, there. But not many of them were sort of close to the front, or in fact wrote really very important reports on the suffering that they witnessed. That, unfortunately, was not really the attitude of the time as far as newspapers were concerned.
In fact, I mean, communications were generally very bad, and you point out that the White Armies were only able to communicate with each other via Paris, which didn't help their military.
Sometimes took 3 weeks for messages to go sort of, you know, back and forth.
Yeah. So there's several more questions coming in. But there's a very good one, just stepping back a bit from, it says Alex McGrory, but it may actually be John McGrory, who was our agent, our indefatigable agent in our local election campaign, and has kept us all out of jail, which we're very, very grateful. And he says, what makes your book so engaging is the mixture of high politics with an insight into the lives of ordinary people. And his question is, were first-hand accounts easy to access from archives, and were there any challenges in doing so in the context of Russian history being used for political purposes, and also the general sort of closing of the archives? And given the furore that surrounded your entirely accurate depiction of Russian or Soviet behavior in Germany at the end of the war, I'm wondering how favorably the Russian authorities looked on your researches this time.
Well, the Russian authorities fortunately didn't really know about it, because I owe everything really to Luba Vinogradova, who I've worked with now for the last 28 years. And ever since we worked on Stalingrad together, starting in 1994. And Luba has been absolutely brilliant over the last 5 years. This is actually even when I was only halfway through my previous book. She started work in the Russian archives. And we had a wonderful mutual friend who was a professor who involved very much in with the archives, who would have a letter for Luba to say that she was working for him, so that she was never associated with me, which was a very useful defense, if you like. And Luba had, right from the start, I could see, has had this brilliant nose sense for, I mean, she and I had a very, very similar attitudes on exactly the sort of material that we wanted for the book. And so, in fact, actually, there was very little trouble at all in accessing these archives in Petersburg, in Moscow, and many other places. One of the other points, which actually is quite interesting, is, of course, one of the alarming moments at the beginning of the war on Ukraine was the advance on Kiev, because there the Ukrainian archives had really all of this material, which if you couldn't get at it in Moscow, you could always find it in Ukraine, in Kiev, in their archives, where it had been copied. And that's where, you know, Tim Snyder and others have done so much of their brilliant research. And in fact, our Ukrainian colleague, who's he in fact, of course, had to leave his archive card behind and get his family over the border, and then he's still fighting Kiev. Sorry, Kharkiv. So that was a moment where, of course, one thought, my God, will the Russians, if they do seize Kiev, will they take all the Ukrainian archives there back to Moscow to make sure that foreigners can't see them? But fortunately, that proved not to be the case. But the interesting thing is that they were far more sensitive about the Second World War and the sources there than they were about the Russian Civil War. I was expecting Luba to have many more problems, but in fact, she hardly had any at all. So there is, I mean, part of it I think has come about actually, in a way, bizarrely, thanks to Putin, and this sort of double-headed attitude, if you like, towards the past, yes, and towards the Russian Civil War.
You're absolutely right. I think this idea that both sides were absolutely brilliant is the sort of Putin line on this. And the whites were noble and romantic and Christian, that was great. And the Soviets were great because they set up the greatest country there's ever been. And it's sort of completely bizarre trying to put it's like putting fire and water side by side. But that they do manage to do that. But there's an excellent question which I should have got to earlier, but I flicked past it by mistake, from Annie. James Lisbon, and which is about anti-Semitism, because this comes up almost on every page, and then they massacred the Jews. And this does, I mean, one could feel that, you know, I mean, everybody was a loser in a way in this war, but the absolutely sort of cataclysmic suffering was borne by the Jewish population, who had nobody was defending them. The foreigners weren't defending them, the Reds weren't defending them, the whites weren't defending them. The Reds hated them because they were bourgeois, and the whites hated them because the whites were anti-Semitic, and everybody just, you know, took it in turns to massacre them. And it seemed to me it was really the sort of the most particularly reprehensible bit of the generally reprehensible violence.
Well, that's absolutely true. I mean, it was worse in sort of Ukraine than almost anywhere else. I mean, I talk about the way that the whites particularly used it as a form of vengeance almost, or when they were going to have to give up a city as the Reds advanced. And for example, take Kolchak's Northern Army when they were forced to leave Yekaterinburg. Then they massacred some 2,200 Jews in this sort of bitterness of defeat. But this was sort of part of the obsession that because there were so many Jewish commissars, they had sort of leapt to the conclusion that all Jews were Bolsheviks, and sort of to justify, if you like, their sort of racist prejudices. Now, there were perfectly good reasons why so many Jews did support the Reds after the way that the whites had treated them, or rather the proto-whites had treated them in the form of the Black Hundreds, even before the First World War began. And so, not surprisingly, no Jews were allowed to be officers in the Tsarist army. And so, as a result, you had many of the leaders of the Soviets, the soldier Soviets, were Jewish, because they could read and write, and they were extremely intelligent. And so, you know, the soldiers were perfectly happy to have them run their Soviets. And this, of course, again convinced the right that, in fact, they were all secret Bolsheviks. But the real massacres, as I say, came usually towards the end when the whites were withdrawing. But there were exceptions too. I mean, there was a red ataman. The worst of the lot, of course, were the Cossacks, who had this obsessive idea also of anti-Semitism. And whenever they came across, they didn't even wait until they were being pushed out by the Reds. Whenever they came across a Jewish community or whatever, they would loot it first of all. And then, if they were feeling particularly bitter and angry, then they would massacre any survivors. Where the sort of Cossack mentality came from. Was it partly because they believed that Jewish grain merchants stole from them, or there was a feeling that, because the Jews were so clever, they therefore were cheating the peasantry and were controlling the food supply. And this was something which I think that I can't remember whether Anne Applebaum brings into her book of the Great Famine, but some of the Bolsheviks started passing rumors around that actually the shortage of food in Ukraine in the 30s during the famine was entirely due to the Jews. So one actually found an anti-Semitic card actually being played by the Stalinist authorities at that stage, which may have contributed to the reason why a minority of Ukrainians did actually support the Nazis when they arrived, thinking that this was going to be their release from the Soviet sort of prison camp, if you like, but they changed their minds pretty quickly as soon as they realized what the Nazis were going to do and what they were doing, both to ordinary Ukrainians as well as to the whole of the Jewish population.
Well, that brings the discussion to Ukraine, on which there are a number of questions which we might, as we move towards the end, might dwell on a bit. So Lucy Lubbock says that the brutality we're seeing in Ukraine, which of course has echoes of what we were seeing during the Civil War in terms of the mindless destruction and vengefulness, but has elements of being a civil war. And how far should one see Ukraine as a civil war as opposed to being a war between two countries? I also need to apologize to Alex McGrory for conflating him with his dad, who's also on the Zoom call, and John, who is indeed our agent, for whom I'm still very grateful, said just wonders whether you have any thoughts about how the conflict in Ukraine might end. And I suppose I might throw in one myself, that in all do you see places leaping out from the modern map of the war in Ukraine that had particular significance during the Civil War?
Well, yes, historians having to predict the future is always sort of slightly ironic, but it seems to be the standard form. I think it can play out in sort of 4 or 5 different ways. There's no doubt about it. I think probably you too, Edward, would certainly agree with Anne Applebaum and those who argue against any idea of the off-ramp, the idea that Putin should be allowed to save face. If Putin is allowed to save face and say do a partial pullback, then there will be another attack later. I mean, it will be recul pour mieux sauter later. And that, in fact, rather, as we say, Minsk 2 or whatever, is not going to solve the problem at all. And Ukraine will be in a desperate position, because who will want to invest in Ukraine if everybody is just waiting for the next time that Russia attacks again? So there has to be a definitive ending, in the sense that it's got to be a sort of clear cut from one way or the other. There's no way that Ukraine can accept, if you like, it might be able to accept, say, a partial loss of territory which it has already lost, particularly in the Donbass or Crimea. But it's not up to the West to force a solution or a formula on Ukraine, because otherwise I think it'll be like Munich, it'll be like the forcing Czechoslovakia to accept the loss of the Sudetenland. And I think that is both morally wrong, and the idea that sort of for the reasons of realpolitik, of course argued by Kissinger, for reasons of realpolitik, that it may be good for the rest of the world, is not necessarily true, because if we allow this sort of aggression to succeed, particularly in a world where authoritarianism is growing rather than diminishing, then I think we're just storing up problems for the future.
Well, thanks so much for that. Anyone who is expecting a vigorous disagreement this evening is going to be disappointed. I'm afraid I completely support that. A final question, I think it may be final because we were running out of time, but it's another one from Christopher Clement Davis. And it's just about what it's like writing history these days. And do you feel the so-called cancel culture blowing its cold breath down your neck? I guess you have been cancelled in Russia, and if I'm not mistaken, I think you were banned in Ukraine at one point for something. They're possibly not on an imprecise reading of your work. But give us some more general thoughts on what it's like being a historian in this sort of febrile and rather polarized intellectual climate we live in now.
Well, very quickly on that Ukrainian bit, it was rather ridiculous. It was actually what they were complaining about was a translation by Russian publishers as Bucharacticus, which for an edition which was sold in Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine. So I was not in any way responsible for that. But anyway, I did find myself in rather an extraordinary position that, having been condemned for lies, slander, and blasphemy against the Red Army by both the Russian embassy and government, I then found that the Russian embassy was supporting me against Ukraine when the Ukrainians wanted to cancel the book. So, I mean, but that was just, as I said, that was just laughable. But you're absolutely right. I fortunately, and when one's writing about history specifically of a particular period, with fortunately no element of slavery or colonialism in the, shall we say, accepted sense of the term involved here, I don't feel very vulnerable in that particular way. But I am always appalled at this idea that it seems to be the great fashion today amongst the younger generation that one should impose the values of and the judgments, if you like, of today on earlier periods when they were simply irrelevant. And for me, I think that is ahistorical. It is, in fact, it's historical illiteracy. But I'm afraid it's something which is gathering force in a way, that somehow we've got to change the past, which is preposterous, you know. The debate has now even reached into the question of classical studies. You know, should we study Greece and ancient Rome when in fact they had slaves? And, you know, should we therefore sort of cancel them as a culture? I mean, when it's got to that stage, one really does fear for the future of education.
But you do make very clear moral judgments about the behaviors of the Reds and the Whites, and you're not saying, oh, well, this was all quite normal for Russia. They've been killing each other for ages, so it was just another massacre. You have some pretty blistering assessments of them, and one could argue that by the standards of the time, they didn't think they were doing anything wrong because it was in the cause of the proletarian internationalism or restoring the divine, semi-divine rule of the Tsar.
Well, indeed, they did believe that. But I think that what one sees, and this is the difference going back to what we were saying about the First World War and the Russian Civil War, is that the whole ideological aspect has suddenly accelerated the, if you like, the killing machine. And this, I think, has become a one of the explanations of why the slaughter was so hideous and so cruel and so bitter. It meant that you were seeing your enemy in completely dehumanized terms. And yes, that's happened before in the wars of religion. I would be the first to accept. But here we are seeing, if you like, the modern equivalent to the wars of religion after what one might describe as, say, a couple of centuries of the wars of realpolitik, or the sort of the wars, if you like, of the 18th century, of before you get the levée en masse of partly the first of all the American Civil War, but then of course the French wars of the early Napoleonic or the Revolutionary Wars, where already one starts to see this sort of the mass conscription turning very much towards mass killing in a way that which we hadn't seen for some time. So I think that really is the trigger, or not necessarily the trigger, but really was the accelerating factor leading from the conventional warfare towards, if you like, revolutionary warfare or counter-revolutionary warfare.
Well, thanks very much for that, Anthony. I just want to finish by the very final couple of sentences of your book, I think, are so brilliant. I just want to give people an idea of what joys await them when they've gone through, waded through all the gore in the middle. But you say, you quote the conservative politician Shulgin, who believed that one of the major reasons for the failure of the whites was a moral collapse, that they behaved as badly as their Bolshevik enemy. And then you write, there was nevertheless one subtle but important difference. All too often the whites represented the worst examples of humanity. But for ruthless inhumanity, however, the Bolsheviks were unbeatable. And that really stuck with me. We have just had a final remark has come in, and this is not something you have to respond to, but it's from Lambertus Cornelius, who says, please everyone buy Chernichivsky beer, which is available at most UK supermarkets, and all proceeds go to humanitarian relief in Ukraine. So when circumstances permit, I hope we can crack open a few of those, Anthony. Now, normally we would have stormy applause and shouts of hurrah, hurrah, to mark the end of this. You've been very generous with your time and energy. So I think we'll just have to do a sort of electronic jazz hands and thank you. Imagine the windows rattling with gratitude for that terrific hour and a bit that you've given us. And I think it's now my pleasure to hand over to a couple of my Lib Dem colleagues, who I hope are on the call, who are going to deliver a few more messages. And you're very welcome to stay on if you want to see what democracy is really like in action.
Indeed.
Or you can apply a cold compress and have some tea. So I think, Rebecca, is it over to you next? I believe that someone is going to jump in unmuted. If not, I'm expecting Rebecca and Jonah at any moment.
Hi, Edward. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. I'll happily take the lead. Thank you so much. You both a very tough act to follow. But I'll try and get this off briefly. Of course, your attendance is, and I'm now addressing everyone on the call. Of course, your attendance is exceptionally valued, as are your donations and your time. But the main reason we're all here is to get Edward elected to the seat coming the next general election, which, as of today, might be sooner than anticipated. And with regards to doing that, the way for you to help us most is clear. We've got a volunteer page on the website, be it activism, technical skills, fundraising abilities, the ability to manage volunteers. Any abilities you have are exceptionally highly valued. So I'm going to post a link on the group chat for you to go on and find that form. And I'll also be posting my email address to contact me if you have any queries about membership, activism, or any of the like. Please do get in touch. I look forward to your contact. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonah. Can you all hear me now? Am I audible now? Hello? Excellent. Okay, great. So I just wanted to add to what Jonah said. The Conservatives have a great advantage over us in that they have big ticket donors. We don't, as Lib Dems. It would be extremely helpful if you could all give generously. Every pound counts towards the effort to get Edward elected. It is extremely important that we refill our war chests. The conservatives are quite likely to fight very, very dirty. I echo what Jonah said about volunteering, and it is very helpful if you can, if you qualify, to join the local cities and Westminster Liberal Democrat Party. New members help us to grow the efforts, and word of mouth feeds more volunteers. So I would appreciate it if you would all do that. And if you could join us for our launch event, which will be Sunday the 12th, 6 p.m., Carpenter's Arms Pub, Seymour Place, West 1, and we'll post that onto the group chat as well.
And it may well be that we're then already discussing the who's going to be the Prime Minister after Boris Johnson has crashed and burned, and that would be really interesting. Or not bad for us, but good for the country. I mean, but terrible for the country. Boris has fought off the challenge, and we now have our best recruiting sergeant marching alongside us on the doorstep as we play our game of who can find the enthusiastic Tory, which is a very good game and can go on for some time. So I just want to say once more, thank you so much, dear Antony. I so appreciate your books have kept me company over so many years. We've had so many good dinners and talks together, and no one would ever think, I am right on this, you failed history A level, didn't you? That's a fact. Antony did. And so we thank you from the bottom of our hearts, and I look forward to seeing you all on the doorstep, or maybe at the Tiverton by-election, which is our next chance to get out and really make a difference. If we can win that seat, which I first campaigned in 1974, can you believe, age 12, that will be a really good launch pad for the summer. So thank you all very much indeed, and thank you particularly to all the organisers, to Jonathan, to Andrea, to immensely long-suffering, patient and resourceful Constance, to Martha, to Jonah, to John. I'm sure I've left someone out, but you have been an absolute star in turning this around so very quickly from a physical event to a virtual event. And we will hope to see Antony in person next time. Thanks very much indeed, and goodbye, everyone.
Bye. Goodbye.